If I found favor in your eyes, if I'm living for more than just to die, if I only have a moment, Father, use me for your purpose. If your kingdom is my harbor, if I'm meant to walk on waters, if I call upon you day and night, Father, would you stay right by my side? You give me reasons to love you for. You've given me reasons to love you more. You give me reasons to love you for. You've given me reasons and reasons to love you more. If I'm called to be like Yeshua, not a problem but an answer. If you will save me from the fire, Father, I'll raise my hands higher. You give me reasons to love you for. You've given me reasons to love you more. Praise Yahweh. You may all be seated. All right, so I want to introduce to you Pastor Suuqiina. He's a man from nowhere, and he goes everywhere. He's actually a traveling minister. He's been here before. We've really enjoyed his presentations, and I know you're going to enjoy his presentation today. And I do want to tell you guys that sadly he's going to be leaving right after he speaks because he has another place to go to. He's that kind of a guy. He's always traveling, always on the move. But I know you're going to enjoy his message for today. So let's give him a round of applause as he walks up here.
Shabbat Shalom. So it's Stairway 1, Suuqiina 0. I fought the stairway in the Stairway 1. Thank you. Past this Illinois Highway Patrol on the way here this morning, he had pulled over a mime. He was telling him he had the right to remain silent. I'm going to tell you a story today that covers about 760 years, but I'm not going to take that long to tell it. So I will condense quite a few of those years. I was reading in Acts 17 one day, and many of you are familiar with this passage of Scripture about Paul speaking on Mars Hill in Athens. And what caught my attention was at the end, it says that some scoffed at him and some laughed and some wanted to hear more of his message. But some of them believed, and amongst them was Dionysius the Areopagite and Damaris. And I wondered what their names were doing there. And why, if some believed, why were there only two names mentioned in the passage? I have that kind of mind that just has to ask those kinds of questions. What is this person doing here? Now, we don't know much about Damaris except that she's mentioned again in 3 John as a faithful servant in the body of Messiah. So she must be like a lot of you women here who, when something is needed, something is called for, you're those kinds of people as well. And she did it so well, she got mentioned in the Bible. That's really a remarkable thing. We don't know if she had a family. We don't know anything historically more about her. But we'll meet her not too distant future, and maybe we'll get to hear her side of that testimony, why she responded on that particular day when the Apostle Paul, Rabbi Shaul, spoke. So my focus is going to be on Dionysius. Now, in order to understand his story, we have to back up 760 years, or about 700 years before Yeshua. And there was a plague in Greece, and many people were dying of the plague. And the Areopagites, the counselors, the Stoics, the philosophers, the educated ones, were meeting together trying to figure out a solution. And of course, in Greece, that meant consulting gods and goddesses. In fact, the most common phrase in Greece at the time was, "Oh my gods." And they had a pantheon of them, you know. They had, oh man, it was crazy the amount of gods and goddesses they had. But they couldn't figure out which god could solve the problem of the plague. And finally, one of their leaders said, there is a man on the island of Crete, and he is a prophet, he's a poet, and he's a philosopher. And we have heard that when he prophesies, things actually come to pass. And the leader had a hard time getting the Areopagites to agree to send for this man because they were prejudiced. And they saw the people of Crete as only Cretans. That's where that little term comes from. It's a rather derogatory reference from the Grecian people towards another people that they thought were uneducated, poor, foolish people. It's like when the two cows were talking and one of them said, "Moo," and the other one said, "Shut up, you uneducated bovine." That's kind of how the Grecians viewed the Cretans. Now, this poet's name was Epimenides, and they sent for him, and he paid his passage over to Greece and brought him to Athens and shared with him their plight of this plague and the fact that many people were dying of this plague and they couldn't find one of their gods or goddesses to be placated enough to stop the plague, and they wondered if he had some insight into their dilemma. After a few days of contemplation, he spoke to them and he gave this order: I want you to take some black sheep and some white sheep and some spotted sheep, and you are to deny them food and water for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the 4th morning, you're to release them on the side of a hill that he specified. And if any of them lie down, you're to mark that spot, and you're to build an altar, and you're to sacrifice that sheep on that place, knowing full well that that would be a supernatural event, because if sheep have been starved for 3 days and 3 nights, they're going to go out and graze immediately, at least get the dew off the grass so they can slake their thirst. But on the morning of the 4th day, some of the black sheep lay down, and some of the white sheep lay down, and some of the spotted sheep lay down. And so, being true to Epimenides' prophecy, they mark those places, and they began to build altars, stone altars, on those places, and to sacrifice those sheep. And so they had altars to Zeus and altars to other gods and goddesses, whatever their pantheon of gods that they worshipped. But Epimenides had a request for them. He said, I want you to build a special altar, and I want you to inscribe in this altar the term agnostotheo, and sacrifice one of the sheep on this altar. Now we come down to the time of Yeshua, and we find ourselves in Caesarea Philippi. And Yeshua and his disciples were in a park there having lunch, probably sushi. I don't know, but probably not too many figs. did have a thing about figs, you know. But he loved fish. He really, wow. Let's see how many fishies we can make out of these 2 loaves and these fish. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Let's see how many fish we can make out of that. Let's do fish sandwiches for everyone. No, stop at 5,000. That's fine. I just place myself historically in those times and think, man, that must have been weird. That must have been really funny. Because like the little kid came up with the sack, you know. I got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And then written on the thing, his mom had written a warning. We'll only feed 5,000. Whoa. I think those kind of thoughts. That's from driving so much. I actually woke myself up at some people's house a little while ago laughing at a joke I'd told myself in my sleep. And it was funny. And then in the morning, the people said, "Did you laugh in the middle of the night?" And I said, "Oh, no, I laughed so loud I woke you up." They said, "Well, yeah, but you were laughing." And I said, "Well, I told myself a joke in my sleep." Now, most of the time when we tell ourselves jokes in our sleep, they're not funny when you wake up, right? You repeat them and you go, "Oh, that's not funny." But mine was funny. I'll tell it to you, see if you think it's funny. I accidentally attached a kaleidoscope to my hunting rifle. Ended up shooting a deer between its 7th and 8th eye. See, it is funny. Plus, it's a visual, isn't it? That's the best jokes, when you can have kind of this cartoon thing go through your head. Like, wow, I see that. So Yeshua is eating with his disciples, and Pontius Pilate and his entourage come through at the exact same time. And we know this because Pontius Pilate had a scribe, and the scribe wrote down everything that occurred in Pontius Pilate's life. And he wrote that he was at the park. Baños is not the Spanish word, it's a Aramaic word back in those days, where the water is coming out of, it's an artesian well coming out of a rock on the side of the hill there, and then so they created a park and people would come there. And the journal of Pilate, he says the Nazarene, that's what he called Yeshua, the Nazarene and his Netzarim were eating in the park. Now, Netzarim is a Hebrew word for little branches. If you remember in John 5, I am the Netzer, the branch, and you are the Netzarim, little branches. And then he talks about bearing fruit, because that's actually where fruit comes out on a tree. It doesn't come out of the trunk, it comes out of the little branches. And so I've taken to calling myself that. People say, "Do you have faith?" Yes. Are you a Christian? No. What are you? I'm a Netzarim. And that opens the gate to share what a Netzarim is. It's kind of a subtle way of backing into giving your testimony. Of course, as a Native American, when I say I'm a little branch, they ooh, hey, he's a pagan. He thinks he's part of a tree. I go, yeah, you're right, I am part of a tree. And the tree told me that. So deal with it, you know. They say, "Does the tree have a name?" I say, "Yes." "What is it?" "G-O-D." G-O-D. Well, let's all groan at the same time then. That's the goal of my humor, is to get a whole congregation to groan out loud at the same time. That's what I'm after. Okay? So, in this park, they had carved grottos into the walls of the rocks, and they had put various carvings or busts of people in these grottos. And Pontius Pilate writes that the Nazarene points to the bust of Alexander the Great, and he asks his Netzarim, "Who do men say that I am?" So they already knew what the Pharisees thought of him, and he knew what the Sadducees thought of him, and he knew what the scribes thought of him. But what do the average people on the street, what do they think of me? Who do they think I am? And Cephas, Peter, who has his best day and his worst day in the same day, he speaks up and says, "You are the Mashiach, the son of the living Elohim." And Pontius Pilate writes this down in his journal, which now you understand why when Pontius Pilate later asks him in the trial, "Are you the Messiah of Israel?" he doesn't answer him. Pontius Pilate had already heard the answer. And now he had to decide. Yeshua wasn't going to decide for him. And that's true for all of us. He doesn't make the decision for us. If we want Yeshua in our lives, we have to decide that critical decision. Is he the Messiah, the Mashiach, or is he not? It doesn't come from man's theology and doctrines. That's what Yeshua told Cephas. Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you. It's not the doctrine of soteriology that I learned for a full semester in seminary. It's a person, and that person is a Mashiach. He is the Messiah, not only of Israel, but of the whole world. But we have to decide if that's true for us. That's what makes the relationship personal. Pontius Pilate talks to him about, he says he overhears him talking to his Netzarim about what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. And he says, Cephas speaks up and says that we'll never let this happen to you. And Pontius Pilate writes that the Nazarene rebuked him and said, "Get behind me, Hasatan." So, you got 1 minute where Peter is, "Thou art the Messiah, the Mashiach, the son of the living Elohim," and now you're getting behind me, Satan. He has his best day and his worst day in the same day. I think he's the most American of the disciples. I think we're that way many times. We have our best day and our worst day in the same day. We can be right there. This is, "I love you," and I lift up my hands, and I never knew him. Never heard of the guy. And it can happen in the same day. Well, we might not say those words. We just stay silent when we had an opportunity. And our silence betrays us. So Pontius Pilate is well aware of who Yeshua is as the Nazarene, and he's well aware of who the Netzarim are. So that a few years later, when this man is standing before him, he knows who he is. Pontius Pilate was visited by a man from Greece named Dionysius the Areopagite. He writes that in his journal. Dionysius the Areopagite from Athens is in Jerusalem, and I have asked him to attend the crucifixion of the Nazarene. and report back to me all that he sees and hears. So this Dionysius goes and is a part of all that we read in the scriptures of the crucifixion. And when it's over, he comes back and he tells Pontius Pilate everything that he experienced, the darkness, the earthquake, the things that are said on the cross between Yeshua and the robbers and the malefactors, and the things that the people say and the things that the rabbis say when the name was written over his head, Yeshua of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which spells out Yod-He Vav-He as the first letter of those words. And they said, they came back and told Pontius Pilate, you can't have that over his head on the cross. And he says, what I have written, I have written. I know who you're killing here. Dionysius even reports about the soldier who took his spear and plunged it into Yeshua's side. He says a wealthy man that he didn't know by name, a wealthy man had taken the body off the cross and had gone away with it. Of course, we know from the scriptures that that was Joseph of Arimathea, and that he had provided his own grave site, shall we say, for temporary use, by the way. That's faith when you give up your own grave site, because he's only going to, rent it for 3 days and 3 nights. That's it, However, he did not charge a fellow Jew retail. Some of you will get that on the way home. He wasn't present. Dionysius was not present for the resurrection or anything that occurred after the crucifixion. When he went and reported to Pontius Pilate, Pilate asked him what his estimation of what had occurred. What do you think happened? And it's really interesting that Dionysius responded to him directly and said, either you killed the author of the universe, or the universe is coming apart. And in Pontius Pilate's journals, he immediately fell to his knees and received the Nazarene as his redeemer. Probably largely due to the prayers and influences of his wife, who the Bible had already told us was a believer. We don't hear much of Pontius Pilate after that, because once you become a believer in the Roman culture, you're considered not only a heretic, but you're considered a member of those people who are seditious and may cause an uprising, and so he was removed as governor, and we don't hear him. He kind of disappears from history from then on. But we will see him again, and we will hear his testimony and his side of the story, and it'll be fun to interview his wife and have her tell us what it was like to live in the White House in Jerusalem in those days. We don't hear any more of Dionysius until 60 years later in Athens in Acts chapter 17. And Rabbi Shaul, who we call the Apostle Paul, he is on one of his missionary journeys, and he comes into Athens, and they estimate there was somewhere between 20 and 30,000 statues of gods and goddesses in Athens at the time. And the rule was, if you were a Grecian, you had to stop and bow before every statue that you passed. It could take 4 hours to go get a loaf of bread And that's before it was sliced. They just spent multitudes of hours of their lives stopping and bowing before statues. Very poor city planning. The Chamber of Commerce should have looked into that and said, we're not really on this profit curve here in a city this size. We should be, at least make them give an offering at every statue. Don't just bow. We got a budget here. Come on, man. So Paul is speaking in the streets of Athens, and some of these Areopagites hear him, and they say, well, listen, you need to come up to Mars Hill and enter the contest that we have, and see if your story can hold water in our contest. Now, Mars Hill was where the Areopagus gathered, and they had this ongoing contest at that time because they didn't have television or radio, and Shakespeare hadn't been born yet, and so they had never heard the term poor York. To be or not to be? That is the question. It's kind of the early form of Jeopardy, but anyway. Now, on this Mars Hill, where they said 50 to 60,000 people would come, and these men would get up and they would give one-sided debates. And the people were betting how long they could go, and they had their favorites. Charlie the Talker, Jimmy the Verbose, Martin the Sheen, Alexander the Lesser Great. And so what the deal was is they had to speak, but every sentence had to flow from the previous sentence. We call that logic. And the idea was to see how long they could go without breaking logic. That was the contest. The one guy went for 6 weeks. I think I could have gone 11 minutes. Paul was not afraid because Paul was a brilliant man. Paul had studied under Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was considered one of the smartest men that had ever lived in that time. If you were going to become Gamaliel's servant, you had to recite the first 5 books of the Bible in Hebrew without error. Then you qualified to become his student. I'll never be Gamaliel's student. Not in this life and not in the next. That's how smart Paul was. Anointed brilliance. So he goes up to Mars Hill. To a culture that's not his own. Now, this is an important point to make and for you to understand. He did not go there to destroy or replace their culture, like modern Christianity has done to other people groups. We have seen fit to take it upon ourselves to turn all other cultures into American Christians, instead of honoring who the Creator made them to be. And we know that this particular kind of evangelicalism and evangelism doesn't work because John sees every tribe, tongue, and nation gathered at the throne. People get to be who the Creator made them to be. I'm Inuit from Alaska. I am not leftover DNA. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And I can be Inuit and a believer. And I don't have to give up my culture and my language and my instruments and my dance to worship him in spirit and in truth. Obviously, Hebrew people have had to deal with this cultural replacement as well down through the years. The Apostle Paul begins by commending them for being idolaters. It's hard to imagine Apostle Paul doing that because in most of his letters, he is virulently opposed to idolatry. And the reason he is there is because the church was allowing syncretism, and they were allowing just a little bit of the paganism to come on in and be part of, their thing. I will not digress into remarks about Easter and Christmas. Oh, I just did, didn't I? Sorry about that. Well, not so sorry about that. Yes. Oh, you Grecians, I see that you are entirely superstitious. You are New Age seekers of truth. He begins by complimenting their paganism, if you will. But he uses it as a bridge to their own thinking, I think you and I know I have judged people for their quote-unquote paganism and never really seen the fact that these people are seeking something. The Grecians wanted spirituality. And they were so afraid they were going to miss God, they just came up with all kinds of gods. So in case they, if it's not that one, maybe it's this one. We don't want to miss. Have you ever heard that phrase? You're afraid you're going to miss God? You can't miss him. David said, if I go way over there, there he is. And if I go way down there he is. And he was trying to escape. You can't get away. Even in your pitiful times of rebellion, and you thought you were so far from him, if you'd have actually looked around and seen in the spirit, he had the tail feathers right in his hands. And you thought you were running headlong into independence. He goes on to tell them, now, I have noticed that you have all these altars and all these gods and goddesses, but you have one here that has the name, the unknown God, inscribed on it. The words were agnostotheo. He said, that's the one I want to tell you about. So there's one altar that survives 760 years. Now, I don't know if you've seen photos of Athens or been to Greece, but pretty much all the stuff from that era are ruins. And they're not ruins because other nations conquered them or overran them. It's just that when you build stuff out of stone and it cracks and water gets there and freezes, it doesn't take too many years and it's all destroyed. It comes apart on its own. And all the altars that the Athenians had built on the day Epimenides was with them, all those altars were destroyed. They were just pieces of granite. But Epimenides' altar, agnostotheo, survived 760 years so that the Apostle Paul could say, that's the one I'm going to tell you about. And he goes into this wonderful, wonderful thing about the Creator and how he's made all of us, and he's made all men out of one blood, and he has established the boundaries of where they should live and the times where they should live there. And he goes on, and then he quotes a poet. He says, one of your own poets has said, it's in him that we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring. He's quoting Epimenides, the poet from 760 years earlier. I don't know if anybody here can quote a poet from 760 years ago. I know I can't quote anyone from even over 10 years ago. I may know roses are red, violets are blue, but I don't actually know who came up with that the first time. Apostle Paul was smart, and he knew that he would keep the ear of the people, especially if he's quoting their own culture, back to them and use it as a bridge to bring revelation. It's in him that we live and move and have our being. And we are his offspring. He made us. We did not make him, and he doesn't live in buildings made with human hands because he doesn't need that sort of thing. And he goes on to say that this God has created a day when he's going to judge the whole earth, and he's chosen a man to do that. And the proof that he chose this man to do that was by raising him from the dead. And that's where they cut him off, because he broke the logic, but it was a stroke of extreme brilliance. He got 50 to 60,000 people leaving Mars Hill. By the way, the Mars Hill is the same hill that Epimenides had them release those sheep 760 years earlier. He got 50, 60,000 people all going home that same day asking the same question, because they understood where the logic was broken. They were not dummies. The question was, why did this man have to die? Wow. Some of them laughed at him, and some of them mocked him and scorned him. Others said, we want to hear more of this later. Some of them believed, and amongst them was Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius had been at the crucifixion 60 years earlier of Yeshua. He had observed all the elements of that day, and he observed the death on crosses of people. He was familiar with death. He understood death. He knew death. What he didn't know was resurrection. It was a myth amongst the Grecians, but to their knowledge, no human had ever actually been risen from the dead. And so resurrection was deeply held in the mythology of the Grecian people. Even one of their goddesses was given to this concept of resurrection. But they didn't know if it was confined to the gods or if this was a reality that could invade the earth. And so Dionysius was hearing for the first time that this Yeshua that he had observed die had been raised from the dead and was going to be used as the tool by which Yahweh would judge the earth. And he immediately believed. And the reason has to do with his name. because the name Dionysius means death and resurrection. And he had only lived for 60 years, over 60 years. He had only lived half of his identity. He had only known the reality of death, the understanding of death, that it's appointed once to man to die. But he had always wondered, is there something to this resurrection, and how does it fit into who I am, and how can I live this out as a man who bears this name? The Apostle Paul appointed Dionysius the first bishop of Athens, and he served the body of Messiah faithfully. And this was before the time of, obviously before the time of 325 and the whole Universal Church and Catholic Church and the later Protestant Church. It was before anything called church in that matter, in that way, the way that we understand it now. He taught Hebrew roots. He had the people keeping Shabbat. They kept the feasts. He was a faithful leader in the body of Messiah. And then when the Apostle Paul died, he took two of his servants and he went up and he evangelized Germany, and he evangelized France, and he evangelized Spain, and began congregations in those three countries. And then he went to northern France, to the place called Gaul. And these people were a little bit more hostile, and they ended up beheading Dionysius and his two servants. And so he died as a martyr for the faith. And so the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, even though they only came into being hundreds of years later, they revere him as a saint, Saint Dionysius. Anybody in that era that was martyred for the faith are considered saints. Here's my point of this story. I look at how long, and it seems long, that Yahweh was willing to put pieces in place. Beginning 760 years early, he's putting specific things in place, and specific people are fulfilling a larger purpose than they even know themselves. Epimenides doesn't know that his poetry is going to be quoted by the Apostle Paul 760 years later and contribute to the salvation of Dionysius the Areopagite. He probably couldn't even imagine that anybody 760 years later would even quote his poetry. And I give that to you because there's some of you here who have giftings and callings from Yahweh that are going to outlive your lives, if you'll allow him to use you in those miraculous ways. Who knows, maybe 500 years from now, somebody would be singing your song, reading your book, quoting your poem, and it'll contribute to the salvation of someone else. We can't dismiss those possibilities. That has already occurred. It has already happened. It's a done deal. It's part of history. And 760 years may seem like a long time, but I want to tell you that he's been working on your life longer than 760 years. According to Psalm 139, every day of your life was put into a plan and put into action before any one of them existed, it says. So from eternity past, he has looked at you and our time, and he has put all the things necessary for you to get to this place on this day to hear this guy. This is not accidental, and it's not incidental. It's part of how he loves us, and he likes us, and he's smart enough to make all things work together for good to them that love him and are called according to him. You and I are those people. And we've been brought to this time and place for a purpose. And for many of you in this room, and maybe I can say all of you, it has to do with the meaning of your name. So that you can live out who you are, not in a halfway like Dionysius had to do, but in fullness of understanding, value, and meaning. Nothing scares Hasatan more than a person who knows who they are. And almost all of his efforts against us are to prevent us from knowing and being who he made us to be. He doesn't want that. Because people who know who they are confident and they're purposeful. Yes, and they are joyful because the angst is behind, the anxiety. Who am I? Why am I here? That's already in the past. I know who I am. I am Eglalik Suuqiina. Eglalik is our word for Isaac. That means laughter. Suuqiina means good medicine. My name is laughter is good medicine. I know who I am. And I must tell jokes. So, two Jews run into a bar. Oh, you've already heard this. Oh, well. How about baby seal walks into a club? Oh. All right, all together. Oh. So I hope you're encouraged today. Pastor, thank you for hosting me today. Let me just close in prayer and thank you for understanding. I'm going to walk out the door. I'll say my goodbye up here. I'm going to walk out the door and drive to Madison for this evening's meeting. So, Father, Avino, Sheba Shamayim, Yit Kadesh, Shimka. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. You can join me. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
I think he deserves 2 rounds of applause. What do you guys think?